Outside, maybe looking at God's nature, a little bit of green. So, does anyone in the back sitting against the wall have a question that they would like to have us consider right now? Okay.
Thank you. I'm just trying to understand when you talked about the 400-year time gap between Malachi and the birth of Jesus, that was a time for the Israel to lay the foundation of faith. And so I'm trying to understand foundation of faith and foundation of substance as a foundation to receive the Messiah in terms of what that means a little more clearly, because am I correct that John the Baptist, he was kind of the linchpin, he was the key figure to the God, I guess we talk about in general terms, but like it was a specific person. Is it a process? Is the 400 years a whole process that God uses people to be able to make a foundation, and then it has a culminating point, and then in that instant, it's either the foundation is made or it's not?
You know, there are a lot of, if you go online, there are a lot of Christian ministers and professors who talk about the 400 years. And we can study that from the point of view of your question. I can't answer your question right now. But just that we know, what we do know from the Father's teaching is that the foundation to receive the Messiah that was set by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had to be maintained until Jesus actually came, and that would include that 400 years. So there was a 400-year period where there were, so Malachi is the last prophet. So now without prophets, or important prophets, they have to go through 400 years without losing that foundation of to receive the Messiah that had been set at the family level and at the ethnic group level as well.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Tim.
Okay, thank you. See, I could not have said that during the break. Okay, the spirit just turns off. Okay, all right. Let's go to the eras in providential history and the formations of their lengths. So this is what we normally refer to as the parallels of history. And so this shows that that history repeats itself. And, historians such as Arnold Toynbee have noticed this, but they don't know why it repeats itself. What is the purpose? And then from now, history will not be repeating itself. So what happened? That history is no longer repeating itself. Well, that's because the purpose for which history was repeating itself was accomplished, was met in 1970 and 1920. So is God alive in history? If God is alive, how does he act or work in history? If God indeed acts in history, what laws does he use to carry out his actions? And we see in the Old Testament how God is very much alive in the history of the Jewish people, in the history of the people of the first Israel. But what parallels in history tells us is that God is as alive as he was, as much alive in Christian history in the last 2,000 years as he was alive in the history of the Israelite people from Abraham to Jesus, and also as he was alive before that. And so he's been alive in history. He's been participating in history ever since the beginning of the earth. Some people believe that if God exists, he's like a clockmaker who makes a clock that will keep on operating, and he goes off someplace else and maybe makes something else, but he no longer has anything to do with this clock because it will keep on operating forever. But that's not the case. God is very much involved because remember, he created the world. He created the world because he needed an object in which he could invest his love so that he could receive love and joy in return. So God is always involved in history. He's always involved in our individual lives, in each of us. In each of our lives, he's involved. You may not know it, but he knows you. You may not believe in him, but he believes in you. So the eras of providential parallel time identities. What do we mean by parallel time identity? The historian Arnold Toynbee described the historical cycles in which the course of history is an earlier era in an earlier era is repeated in similar form in later eras. Nonetheless, Toynbee was unable to explain why history repeats itself and could not reveal the cause of such parallel time identities. So the providence of God goes from the individual to the family, to the nation, to the world, and to the cosmos and so forth. So we're skipping a couple of stages here, but basically you get the direction. It keeps on expanding, because there are more and more people in the world. In Adam's family, he was the world, right? But there are more and more people, and so the more people under Satan's authority exist, the more difficult it becomes to bring the whole entire world back to God. So why parallel time identities occur? When a human being fails to fulfill his or her portion of responsibility, that failure must be restored through indemnity. This restoration is why different eras parallel each other, and God's responsibility plus human responsibility is what will accomplish God's will. And this grows as time goes on. More and more people are populating the earth. So primary factors affecting the formation of parallel time identities, the restoration of has to be a restoration of the foundation for the Messiah to create the foundation of faith. This foundation of faith is separation of good and evil. There has to be a central figure, the object for the condition, and a time period, which is a mathematical time period. And foundation of substance, the restoration of capacity to govern, it's governance. There has to be a central figure and an indemnity condition to remove the fallen nature, where the person who's in the Cain position will love Abel, person in the Abel position, and establish that able person to mediate between himself and God, and obey that person in the able position, and also multiply goodness. So the types of parallel time identities is a formation state parallel time identity in terms of the content. And this is symbolic. We say this symbolic, and then the growth stage, the parallel time identity is in the current terms of image, and the completion stage parallel identity in terms of the substantial now. So here from Adam to Abraham, it didn't have to be this way, but this is how it turned out. The family level foundation for the Messiah, the providential era to lay the foundation for restoration. This is an era of symbolic time identity. And then from Abraham to Jesus was a national level. Let's check this, whether it's actually national or ethnic group level foundation for the Messiah. Era of providence of the restoration era of image time identity. Carrie, can you put a little check mark there so I can check it with the Reverend News later on? And world level foundation for the Messiah, era of the prolongation of the providence restoration, era of substantial time identity. And then this leads to the second coming of Christ. So these are three, in biblical terms, 6,000 years. Especially the first era, this first time is not actually 2,000 years at all. It's probably at least in the tens of thousands, perhaps in the hundreds of thousands of years, or 100,000 years, something like that. Abraham to Jesus, more in line with the actual time that passed, and then Jesus to the second coming, also more or less that time. So that not exact, that it's not exact, but approximately 2,000 years. So the number of generations and the formation of the number of years in each era of parallel time identity. So there is the growing period, the orderly three stages of growth during the growing period with formation, growth, and completion stage. And each of these we used to say stage and then level. Somehow they changed it to phase and stage. Anyway, then there are 9, I prefer to say levels, and then the 10th level then is in the direct dominion of God. And Adam and Eve, Adam representing heaven, and the number 3, because reason number 3 is heaven because it's God and Adam and Eve. This is God's family. Whereas Eve, then in the earth, this is the 4-position foundation now, so for the earth. And number 12, the 4-position foundation times 3 stages. So the 4-position foundation in the formation stage, the growth stage, and completion stage gives the number of 12. The number 4 is the 4-position foundation in 4 stages, going up, including the direct dominion of God. And number 21 is the completion number, heaven number 3, earth number 4, times 3 stages. And then number 40 is 4-position foundation through the 10 levels of the growing period. So these numbers are important, and they have meaning, and God is a God of numbers. And also Satan knows this, and so Satan also tries to use this. But these are when we say, for example, 40 days of separation after the holy blessing for first generation. It's not just a random number that someone thought of. It actually has a meaning that goes back many thousands of years in God's providence. So then the number of years in each era of parallel time identity. So in the symbolic era, this is in the symbolic time identity, it begins with Adam, 10 generations to Noah, and those 10 generations required 1,600 years. So an average of 160 years per generation. Now, at the time of Noah, as we saw, God shortens the lifespan, and that was in Genesis 6 or so. 7. Here we go in 6:3. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. So in Genesis 6, God sort of pushes down the lifespan, even though Moses himself lived for I think 700 or so years, plus years, but he was born before that, so he doesn't count, I guess. But anyway, you see that the 10 generations from Noah to Abraham only takes 400 years. So there's a substantial reduction in lifespan. But these numbers are also symbolic. So, with the people living like Adam living for 930 years, remembering that this is a symbolic period. So I have to wonder whether this is really 930 times 365 times 24. I think there's many ways of knowing that. And Father has not talked about that as far as I know, so it may be that it's not entirely important for us to know. So anyway, 10 generations and 400 years is what it says in the Bible. And then after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, there is a period of 120 years. The birthright is restored. Here there's a number 120, and then birthright restored. 40 goes to Haran, and then in Haran for 21 years, and then back to Canaan, and then 40 years, and then Jacob meets Joseph in Israel, in Egypt after that. So there is this is the horizontal restoration of indemnity carried out vertically. And then in the image time identity, there is from Abraham to Moses, there is 400 years of slavery in Egypt, but also this, there's also, they get another 30 years tacked on to that. And then from Moses through the period of Judges, or from entering into Canaan through and Joshua and the death of Joshua and the period of Moses, there is the period of Judges. There is 400 years, and then the United Kingdom. Each of the 3 kings, Saul, David, and Solomon, have 40 years. So that's 120 years, and then then Israel is divided between north and south. Because Solomon David actually commits adultery, and God says, okay, I'm not going to divide the kingdom because of you, but after your son it's going to be divided. And so it's divided between north and south after Solomon, and with the south being Israel being Judah, and the north being Israel. But the north is the Cain type one. In other words, that's the one that goes to paganism. And the south, the 2 tribes in the south maintain the providence of God. And then they're taken into captivity in Babylon and return, and all of that together is 210 years. And then after Malachi, there's a 400-year period before Jesus actually is able to come. So then in the substantial time identity, there's 400 years from Jesus to Augustine. And this is a time of persecution under the Roman Empire. But by the time Augustine comes, the Roman Empire has adopted Christianity as its state religion, or at least one of its state religions. Anyway, Christianity is allowed to operate. Then from Augustine to Charlemagne in the year 800 on Christmas Day, the Pope crowns Charlemagne as the Holy Roman Emperor. And then there's a period of 120 years of Christian empire after that. And then, but there's the papacy is divided between East and West. There's a pope in Rome and also a pope in France. And so there's this kind of division. I'm sorry. That's correct. This is between the Constantinople and Rome is the division that's occurring here. So this is a division between Constantinople and Rome, and then papacy is exiled to France here, and then finally returning. And then after Martin Luther, there is a preparation for the second coming. Okay? Going a little bit too fast. All right. Okay, so then these are the parallels that we see. So these things occur because here there was a effort to establish the foundation to meet the Messiah, to receive the Messiah, and sure enough, that was accomplished here. But there had to be a period where they could grow to be able to compete with the surrounding ethnic groups. And so then here from Abraham to Jesus, it takes another 2,000 years for them to have that kind of a substantial sovereignty, or not sovereignty, but at least a size and ethnic group that could be around Jesus and protect Jesus while he was accomplishing his mission, also to work with Jesus in that mission. And that's what would have happened, because God always works through concentric circles. So the ethnic group and the nation of Israel would have been part of that concentric group, and they would have then expanded outward from there to cover the entire world. And then here, because Jesus' mission was not fully fulfilled there, the mission of the Messiah was not fully fulfilled, he had to come again, and so then it takes another 2,000 years going through the same way to re-indemnify everything that was established here. So with the Jesus' crucifixion, all this foundation was lost, so it had to be reestablished in terms of Christian history and in terms of the history of Western Europe, especially the history of those countries that were evangelized by Rome, the Roman papacy, and the Protestant churches that came after it. So the era of the providential restoration and era of prolongation of providential restoration. So the era of providential restoration is from Abraham to Jesus. And the era of prolongation of providential restoration, that is from Jesus to the second coming, from the perspective of providential parallel time identity. So here we're looking a little more detail now at these two. So from Abraham to Moses was a period of slavery in Egypt, but it wasn't all slavery. Obviously, when they first got there, they were welcomed, and they were allowed to stay there, and they were even given land there. But gradually, as their numbers increased, the Pharaoh and the native people of Israel became more threatened by them, and they began to be treated as second-class citizens and eventually as slaves. So when we say slavery in Egypt, it's kind of a general term, but eventually it wound up that way. And when we see what was happening to them, especially at the end, they were being told to build bricks without straw, for example. They were being abused, in other words. And then the persecution of the early church by the Roman Empire was analogous to this. It was parallel to this. And it lasted approximately a similar number of years. And then by the time that Augustine came around, and Augustine is an important figure in the Christian history because he published the City of God, the book that really and also the confessions, but especially City of God, that really laid out sort of God's ideal in some form. Then the Moses, and then after that the period of Judges. During the journey to Canaan, they built a tabernacle, and they have the tabernacle. In the period of Judges, they're kind of losing their faith, aren't they? But there's a regional church leadership, and there were about 5 centers of Christianity. Rome was one of them. Constantinople, today's Istanbul, was another one. And Jerusalem was another one, I think, wasn't it? And Antioch and Alexandria, I believe. Wasn't it? Are these the 5? Have I done that correctly? I think I have. But anyway, there were about 5 regional sort of centers of Christianity around the Mediterranean. And in a similar way. And that was also kind of a parallel to the regional leadership, and there were the patriarchs, and of each of those there was a Rome actually sort of outlasted the others, and that's why they became the center of Christianity eventually. And then Saul, David, and Solomon, the 3 kings, about 40 years each, and Solomon built the temple, and the king was the prophet, or there was a prophet, there was a high priest, and there was a king. So also the Christian Empire and the Catholic Church, we had monks, we had the popes and kings there as well. So this is a parallel there. And then the 40 years of a divided kingdom of East and West, there was a struggle between Constantinople and Rome, and eventually there was a division, and this is what is analogous to the 400 years then of the divided kingdom between Israel and Judah in the south. And then similar to Israel's exile to Babylon and then final return, also the papacy was exiled to France for a while and then managed finally to return. And then the preparation for the advent of Messiah, it was 400 years from Malachi to Jesus. So similarly, approximately 400-year period from the time of Martin Luther until the second coming of Christ. So the period of slavery in the 400 years, we can see parallels here that Abraham's failure in the offering, remember that he failed to cut the pigeon and the dove, caused an invasion by Satan, and this had to be restored through indemnity. So Jacob's 12 children and 70 kinsmen went into Egypt and eventually wound up in slavery. This was punishment for Abraham's failure. And the first Israel exercised circumcision and sacrifice and Sabbath, and they had a lifestyle for a separation from Satan. And then Moses came with the 3 miracles and 10 plagues, and finally accomplished the surrender of Pharaoh, and then left with his people. Then after the slavery and in the wilderness, they received the 10 Commandments and the core of the Torah, which is the core of the Torah, and the completion of the tabernacle, and they began to prepare for the Messiah. Then in the Christian period, there was the persecution under the Rome for 400 years because the Jewish people had failed to uphold Jesus as a living offering, and so this brought about an invasion by Satan. So that had to be restored through indemnity in the many martyrdoms that occurred in those approximately 4 centuries. And Jesus' 12 disciples and 70 followers received persecution under Rome, and persecution, punishment, but also they developed their faith there. And they were the second Israel, and so they had the practice of baptism, which was a kind of a spiritual form of circumcision, cutting off, in other words, from Satan's world, and also sacrificing their lives and martyrdom, and keeping the Sabbath, and maintaining the Holy Communion in remembrance of Jesus, so as to lead a lifestyle that was separate from Satan. And also there were many spiritual miracles and so forth. And then And in AD 13, Emperor Constantine recognizes Christianity, or allows Christianity to begin to exist. And in 392, Emperor Theodosius I designates Christianity as the state religion. And then after the persecution, there's the gospel becomes in the core of the New Testament, and there's the completion of the church, the formation of the early church. Remembering that the Bible did not exist as we know it today for more than 300 years after Jesus died. So finally, when things began to settle down in the 4th century, they got together and canonized the Bible. And then there was so this is the part of the preparation for coming of the Messiah. It's really amazing how much more material we have from our true Father than Christians have had for 2,000 years from Jesus. But they were able to maintain their faith based on that, and also God spoke to them through that. So this is the Bible is a kind of a supernatural book in a sense, that God actually is able to use this book because He has blessed this book to speak to us, and we see that in our rimas every morning. So then we're talking about now the parallels between the period of Judges in the Old Testament history and the period of patriarchal system in Christian history that followed the first 400 years. So this is another period of 400 years, and the mission of the judges was to be a prophet, a priest, and a king. And after the Israelites people entered Canaan, their land was divided among the judges, and they formed a new chosen ethnic group in a new land centering on the judges, and formed the basis for a Jewish feudal society, you could say. And then Israelites had to exalt God's will for the tabernacle in obedience to the guidance of the judges. But unfortunately, they did not, and instead they failed to destroy the tribes of Canaan and were influenced by their customs, falling into idol worship, and there was finally confusion in the practice of the faith. And if you read the Old Testament book, it really is a cycle of people getting in trouble and asking a judge, this judge or other, to lead them in a military conquest or military defense of their worship, and then they go back to God, but they keep falling away. I really see it as the dark ages of Jewish history, this 400 years. So in the case of the Christianity, the second Israel, after they're no longer being killed now, they're no longer having to martyr themselves to the Roman Empire, but now they have patriarchs. The patriarchs were in the monastery, the Pope and King, and there's the migration of the Germanic people into the Roman Empire, and invasion of the Huns, which is a Mongolian tribe, into Western Europe in the 4th century, and the migration of Germanic peoples into Western Europe, and Christianity spreads to the Germanic peoples, and the gospel spreads to the kingdom of the Franks, which is more or less a modern-day France. Yeah. And God established the Germanic people as the new chosen ethnic group in the new lands of Western Europe, and formed the basis of a Christian feudal society. The Christians had to exalt God's will for the church in accordance with the guidance of the patriarchs, but unfortunately they did not do that. Instead, they were influenced by Germanic paganism and the confusion in the practice of faith. And the king has pointed out, in many of the Christian practices that we have today, there is still a influence of Germanic paganism. The Christmas tree is one example. The Easter bunny and Easter egg and this kind of stuff as other examples, these kinds of things. And the reason why December 25th is Christmas actually has nothing to do with the birthday of Jesus, the day that Jesus was born. Because we see in Matthew that Jesus was actually born on a day when the shepherds were in the field keeping the flock. And that would have to have been, there's only one time a year that occurs, that would be when the sheep are actually giving birth, which would be in the early spring. So why is December 25th Christmas today? Is because in the paganism of the Germanic tribes, you had the winter solstice, all right? And the winter solstice is kind of that's the shortest day. That's the darkest day. And that's the day when it looks like the sun is going to die. But then after that, about 3 days later, the sun is coming back. days are getting longer again. Yay! So there is the whole, and the king has explained it much better than I can, but there is this whole ceremony then, and Christians kind of sort of appropriated that, or in order to spread, I suppose you could say, Christianity sort of said, okay, this is the day that that light resurrected. This is the day that Jesus was born. And so that's how December 25th became Christmas. It has nothing to do with Jesus' actual birthday. And Father says actually that Jesus was born on the fourth day, I think, of the first month. And of course, the Roman calendar actually began in what today is March. And so it would have been in early spring that Jesus was born. But so this was an influence of the Germanic tribes, and also the Christmas tree itself and the decorating the tree and these kinds of things were influences of paganism, which remain with us until today. So anyway, so this is the confusion in the practice of faith. And not that we don't believe in Christmas. It's okay to celebrate Jesus' birth, but just be aware that that's not the real thing. Yeah. All right, and then here in Jewish history, in the Old Testament history, we have at one point then after the period of Judges, the people of Israel cry out for a king. We want a king, so a king can come and sort of arrange things and bring order to the situation. So the prophet Samuel anoints Saul as the first king. This was 800 years after Abraham. And the ideal of the tabernacle evolves to the ideal of the temple and the formation of the kingdom. But God tells Saul that, no, you're not going to build the temple. You're not going to build the temple. Or even David actually also is not able to build the temple. Only Solomon is able to build the temple by God's instruction. And formation of the kingdom, and then Solomon's temple and kingdom, and then the central figure of the foundation of faith is the king, and he is the high priest of a spiritual kingdom, and also he is the king of a substantial kingdom. And King Saul fails in Abel's position, because of the influence of pagan cultures around them. They get this idea that because I'm king, and I can have as many women as I want. And some of it is diplomatic, Oftentimes in those eras, someone would offer their daughter to someone else so as to maintain peace between the two tribes or something like that. But they had the Ten Commandments. They had the Ten Commandments about adultery. So I don't know how they defined adultery, but he fails in Abel's position. And the foundation of substance fails, and King Saul disobeys God's command as conveyed through the prophet Samuel, and he falls through sexual immorality. And same is true with David. David also commits a lot of sexual immorality. In fact, how was Solomon born? It's because David saw this beautiful woman, right? And he wanted her as his own, but she was already married. So he sends her husband out to the front line so that he will get killed. and that's David, and that's how Solomon is born, how he's conceived as the son of David. So David also makes mistakes, and God is through with him, but he says, okay, but I won't divide the nation now, but your son can be king, but after that, no, all bets are off after Solomon. Okay, Carrie.
Yeah, Father talked about how he used the situation with Uriah and, forgive me, what's Bathsheba and David, as he actually talked about that as being a restorational relationship with Uriah being the archangelic position and David being in the Adamic position, but I mean, it was a grossly, I'm not doubting Father, but it's a grossly immoral act that David committed. How can that qualify as a participating in restorational process?
So yeah, it can be seen in that light, yes, but God can use it perhaps to count as such as restoration, but that doesn't excuse David's action of very. I mean, what is the Ten Commandments said? Thou shalt not covet, right? Thy neighbor's wife, and that's exactly what he did. So once it's done, then perhaps God can say, "Okay, I'll give it that meaning, or I'll accept it in that meaning." But I don't think that excuses David, or says, "Okay, well, it was okay for David to do that." I don't think. My opinion.
Yeah, and is it sometimes a balancing act? Like David still was able to maintain his position, and so by him still being a central figure in God's providence, then that didn't topple him from that position.
But look here in 2 Samuel. See, God has led me right to the right verse, 11:27. All right. And when the mourning was past, this is for Uriah, okay? Mourning for Uriah was past. David sent and fetched her to his house, and she became his wife and bare him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord.
Right, and then their first son died as a result of that part. Yeah. Right, but I guess so I know that, but just the conundrum is how the heck could that be a condition that God can use? That's what I don't understand.
So God uses imperfect people. Newsflash.
I mean, Moses struck a rock a second time, right, and that was it for him. David.
Well, that's because the rock was Christ.
David seduced, somebody else's wife, and he got to keep his position. Maybe I'm just looking at it horizontally or externally.
But then God did say then that, you know what? Because of you, Israel is going to be divided. Not now, but after Solomon, it's going to get divided. Okay?
Okay, so there was ramifications for that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, David's immorality was a problem, and it was the direct cause for the division of the kingdom by God. Yeah. And also, the Lord says, in 12:10, "Now therefore the sword shall never depart from thine house, because thou hast despised me and hast taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be thy wife." So God is not at all pleased about this situation. Yeah. "Behold, I will raise up evil against thee out of thine own house, and I will take thy wives before thine eyes and give them unto thy neighbor, and he shall lie with thy wives in the sight of this sun. For thou didst it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun." And David said unto Nathan, who was the prophet who was trying to get David to repent, "I have sinned the Lord." And Nathan said unto David, "The Lord also hath put away thy sin. Thou shalt not die." Okay, so he's not going to kill you, all right? But there is a consequence still. Yeah. So, so Solomon is the third generation, and Solomon turns to serving pagan gods brought in by his pagan wives. And how many wives does he have? Probably he didn't even know. What, 1,000? And then how many concubines on the side of that? How many birthdays is he remembering? I don't. And the division of the north and south dynasties, and then pagan gods, Asherah, Milgam, and Gamos, and Moloch, they all are worshipped, and especially by the northern kingdom, Israel. But the southern kingdom isn't all that good either, but it's better than the northern kingdom. So this was the period of the unified kingdom that lasted 120 years after the period of the judges. So in the case of the Christians' history after the period of the patriarchs in AD 800, Pope Leo III crowns Charlemagne as the first Holy Roman Emperor. He calls himself, although it's, as I'm sure every history teacher has ever said, neither holy nor Christian, nor an empire. 800 AD, towards the ideal. But here, though, Augustine puts forth the ideal of the city of God in his book, The City of God, and the formation of the Christian empire there. So at least the ideal is put out there in printed form and in the book form. And the central figure of the foundation of faith was the emperor, and the pope was the spiritual pope in the spiritual empire. He was the head of that, and the emperor was head of the substantial empire of Christendom, beginning in around 800. But the emperor left the position of Abel, and the foundation of substance fails because the emperors failed to be obedient to God's will. And the Christian empire divides after only 3 generations, and so the Charlemagne's sons, grandsons, do not keep it together, and it's divided into East and West Franks, and Italy being ruled by the East Franks, and also it's divided between Constantinople and Rome. So it eventually falls apart very quickly. Because, by the way, of this idea that Charlemagne thought it would be a good idea to divide his empire among his sons and grandsons. So then the era of the divided kingdom of north and south of 400 years, the kingdom is divided, and the United Kingdom divided only after 3 reigns. This is the Jewish kingdom, Israelite kingdom. And the Cain side was the 10 tribes that were Israel. This is the northern kingdom. And they lasted for 260 years and 19 kings. And then the Abel side was the 2 tribes, the kingdom of Judah, and that was the tribe of Judah and Benjamin, I believe, that lasted 394 years, and they had 20 kings. And some of the kings were good and some were bad. The northern kingdom especially had a lot of bad kings. In other words, evil kings means that kings that caused God a displeasure, mainly by adopting the pagan rituals and gods of that. So they are really forgetting their heritage. They're forgetting the fact that they are chosen people, that they are expected to live at a higher standard than the people around them. They've got all these cool gods, and they've got all these beautiful women. Why can't we take these gods and these women for our own? So the northern kingdom was founded by Jeroboam, who had lived in exile during King Solomon's reign, and the royal line changed 9 times during 260 years. Of the 19 kings, none were found to be righteous in the sight of God, not one. And God sent the prophet Elijah from the kingdom of Judah, all right, and Elijah went up there and defeated 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah on Mount Carmel. And fire was sent down upon the altar. Proving the power of God there in the presence of all these people. Another prophets were sent by God: Elisha, Jonah, Hosea, and Amos. The northern kings did not repent. So God allowed the Assyrians to destroy the north and disqualify them as the chosen people forever. And so we say the 10 lost tribes of Israel. This is where that comes from. They just faded into the woodwork. And then the southern kingdom of Judah was founded by Solomon's son Rehoboam. The royal line continued unbroken from David to Zedekiah. Of the 20 kings who reigned during the 394 years, many were righteous, not all, but many. And following King Josiah, the south was influenced by the northern kingdom and fell into idolatry. The Israelites were taken into exile into Babylon. And God sent 4 major and 12 minor prophets. Minor meaning that their writings are shorter, not that they are lesser in importance, but their writings are shorter in the Bible. Minor prophets to guide the nation, both internal and movement for repentance and reform. But they did not heed the words of the prophets, and so God allowed them to be attacked by Gentile nations, so Egypt, Chaldea, Syria, Assyria, and Babylon, and they're given external chastisement. So then the collapse of the Israelite monarchical society, due to the kings and the people of both north and south being taken into exile. So it looked like Israel was over, that the chosen people were finished, gone. It looked like. But that's not how God planned it. Right? So then God was able to save them, right? So then now we'll get to that in a minute, but first let's look at the divided kingdom of East and West for the Christian Empire. So the Christian Empire divided after only 3 generations, East Franks with Italy, and then the West Franks. Italy was, for all intents and purposes, not really a separate kingdom. And Cain was the West, and Abel was the East, plus Italy. And then under Otto the First, it was the Holy Roman Empire, and papacy became corrupt, and God sent prominent monks to admonish the papacy. And these were Thomas Aquinas, Francis of Assisi. And there was a movement for internal reform within the church at that time. And the papacy and the church did not heed God's warning, and God allowed them to be attacked by external people, and then brought about external chastisement. And then here, let's see what it says about the Crusades. When Jerusalem and the Holy Land were under the protection of the Abbasid Caliphate, Christian pilgrims were treated hospitably. But then after the occupation by the Seljuk Turks, pilgrims were abused. So outraged, the successive popes raised the Crusades to recover the Holy Land. But as the king has said, the Islam had taken over now North Africa, which used to be a Christian area. And they were taking over Spain as well. So this was a defensive effort on the part of Christianity. So starting in 1096, 7 crusades were initiated over a period of 200 years, but they continually resulted in defeat. There were some successes, but those successes didn't last for a long time. So then the collapse of the Christian monarchical society, the papacy completely loses its authority and faith. And actually, the Black Death also had something to do with that, because the Catholic Church, or the Church, was saying, believe, and you will not die. But it became clear to people that actually the priests were spreading the disease, because they would go and give the last rites to someone, and then they would go and then they would give the last rites to someone else, and so they began. There was no germ theory. There was no germ theory at that time. They didn't know what was the cause of the Black Death, and they had some pretty weird theories about that. For example, they thought that it was the smell of death that was causing it to spread. And that's why they developed these masks with the long noses, because they would put flowers and other sort of fragrant things in those noses. So that's where that came from. They figured that would prevent them from getting sick if they could only just smell nice things and not have this the smell of death in there, because there was no concept there of a scientific concept of germs. Okay? So anyway, the Black Death really undermined the authority of the church. I mean, the church said that, don't worry, we'll save you, but they weren't saving anybody. So anyway, the papacy loses its authority and faith for whatever reason. And then the loss of a sense of national spirit by the common people, and the mainstay of the feudal society, the lords and knights, were decimated by war, and so there's a loss of a political base. And especially the knights were decimated when, especially the English developed the longbow, right? And then the longbow could be used and was used by commoners. And no longer the knight with the broadsword on a horseback with all the armor and everything like that, but now commoners could actually participate, were actually a big part of warfare now with the development of the longbow. So anyway, the feudal society, the lords and knights were decimated by war, and repeated defeats in wars, massive costs of the war exhausted them, and so society fell into economic poverty during the Middle Ages there. So anyway, this was a parallel, somehow parallel to the experience of the Israelite people and their area of a divided kingdom of east and west. So then the period of Israel's captivity and return, King Nebuchadnezzar basically marched into Jerusalem and takes the royal house of King. I don't know how to pronounce that. Jehoiakim, the prophet Daniel, and the Israelite people were taken into captivity. So Daniel was one of the. They took especially. They didn't take everybody. They took the cream or the elite or the educated class. And Daniel was a young boy, a teenage boy, and he was seen by the Babylonians as having very intelligent. So he was taken and he served in the court of Nebuchadnezzar. So this, and it wasn't just once, but it was over a period of years. I think about 3 times. They were taken to, and some of them established themselves in Babylon. Then, Persia then conquers Babylon, and then King Cyrus now is in charge, and he actually liberates not only the Jews but all the ethnic groups that had been conquered by the Babylonians and brought to Babylon. He says, "Okay, you can all go back to your countries, but especially for the Jews." He gives them money to go back and rebuild the temple, and also says, "You know what? All that stuff that Nebuchadnezzar took from your temple, you can take it back with you. All the things that were in your temple, take it all back with you." And so Cyrus was quite an important man. And so in the Jewish tradition, Cyrus was referred to as a Messiah because he really saved the Jewish people, right? But it says here, Israelites returned to the homeland in 3 waves, because just like when they were leaving Egypt, not everybody wanted to go because they had established businesses and so forth in Babylon. And so it took a little bit of convincing for the prophet said, "Hey, we've got to get back there. Our mission is back there in Canaan." But Babylon is a pretty prosperous city and so forth, and Canaan, Jerusalem is ruins, and you go back there, you're going to have to work. So anyway, they went back in 3 waves, and they established the basis for a renewed faith of God. But it was really during the captivity that they began to look upon themselves and realize, oh yeah, we are the chosen people. We are God's chosen people. We need to live better than this. So let's look at then the parallel period in Christian history, papal captivity and return. So after Pope Clement V, there was a captivity in Avignon, France, for 70 years because the French, arranged for a Frenchman to become pope. And since he was French, they says, what are you doing in Rome? Come to Avignon and live there. So the papacy was sort of in a captivity in Avignon for 70 years. In 1377, Pope Gregory XI returns the papal residence to Rome, and then for 140 years, and then cardinals elect Urban VI, Archbishop of Bari, Italy, as pope. And then the French cardinals who were ostracized elect Clement VII, and now you got 2 popes. Okay, so then they got 2 popes there. And the cardinals in Pisa later rejected these 2 popes and established Alexander V as the true pope, and 2 other popes refused to comply, resulting in 3 different popes reigning simultaneously. So kind of an interesting period in Catholic history there. And the Council of Constance, bishops and archbishops, theologians, and other delegates deposed or led all 3 popes to abdicate and elected Martin V as the new pope. So the 3 popes caused massive confusion and division, and then 1309, and then this basically undermined all authority of the church, and it says here recovered in 1449. But so the exclusive papal authority was recovered and established the basis for a renewed faith after 140 years, so a total of 210 years there. So then there was the captivity and return, and then the period of preparation for the Messiah. This is a 400-year period from Malachi to Jesus. So the 40-day providence for the separation from Satan and final restoration through indemnity is 4,000 years, 4,000 years being from Adam to Jesus. and rebuilding the temple, and repentance and the study of the Torah. Excuse me. And they raised a movement for reformation of faith and restoration of the foundation of faith. The Israelites rebuilt the temple, destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, thanks to Cyrus. And Malachi called for repentance for past worship of pagan gods, and people actually began to study the Torah. Until they meet Jesus, a path of external suffering. There was Persia, Greece, Egypt, just as Jacob's family went through suffering until they left Canaan to meet Joseph. And then there was the reformation of the Judaic faith, preparation as a chosen people who can receive the Messiah, and historical background and preparation for the environment of Christ among the Gentile peoples. So here then Buddha, who lived from 565 to 485 BC in India, established Buddhism, and Socrates developed a Hellenic culture, the philosophical underpinnings of a Hellenic culture. Of course, Aristotle, Plato and Aristotle after him. And then Confucius in China, also Confucianism, establishing the ethics of morality. So if Jesus had been able to fulfill his mission, then all of these other religions were there as a foundation that he could have used. And then, Buddhists would have seen Jesus then as the fulfillment of their religion, and the philosophers of Greece would have seen him as the fulfillment of their philosophies. And China would have seen Jesus as the fulfillment of their religion and philosophy. So religion at that time could have been unified, centering on Jesus. And Jesus was to go from Jesus and Israel and then Rome to speak in the Senate of Rome and to subdue Rome and then to go to the whole world. Are you raising your hand or are you just scratching your head? Okay, okay. Okay, I wasn't sure because from the corner of my eye, it looks like you're raising your hand for a question. Okay, that's all right. Go ahead and scratch that. So then the Christian period, the 40-day providence for separation from Satan and final restoration through indemnity, indemnifying 4,000 years. That was built and then lost. There was a religious reformation in the early 16th century, starting in 1517 when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church. And then repentance and study of the gospel and pioneering the path of the practicing of faith and the restoration of the foundation of faith. And after the Pope returned to Rome and the medieval Christianity, Luther created a movement for religious reformation and the repentance for sins of the medieval era and following the light of the gospel and pioneering and developing the faith. And so until the second coming of Christ, the path of internal suffering, the competition between humanism and enlightenment, and of course all the religious wars that took place after that as well. The religious wars were very, very tragic and very, a lot of people died because of their religion. The Renaissance brought about politics and economy and culture and science that developed in there, rapid development and maturation of an environment that can receive the second coming, and then the second coming of Christ is the third year of Israel in the United States and the world. Yes, Carrie?
What's the connection between internal suffering and humanism and enlightenment?
This would be sort of the internals, I guess, the suffering and the conflict between those two outlooks, shall we say, outlooks or philosophies, or not between them, but because of them, because of both of them, the humanistic and humanistic outlook, enlightenment outlook. There was the religion was now losing its credibility in general among the population. The development of science and the science denying religion.
Yeah, enlightenment was kind of a mixed bag, though, right? It had a secular aspect, and it also had some positive aspects.
Okay. Yes. Nothing is 100% bad. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So, okay. So then, this is the preparation that took place for 400 years from the time of Martin Luther. So the crossovers of God's sovereignty and Satan's sovereignty in restorational history. So here, Satan's sovereign. Satan has victory at the time of Jesus' crucifixion, and so that it looks like Rome has won, or that Satan has won. Rome, with its pagan gods, now has gotten rid of Jesus, and so now it can rule forever. That's what it looks like. But Satan's sovereignty, though, is declining because Rome is actually declining a lot, right, during the 4th century and 5th century especially. And eventually then it falls, and then and also at the same time, God's sovereignty looks like it has been completely destroyed. And it's Christians are being killed as soon as they can be found and arrested. But gradually, though, through the martyrdom and the blood of the martyrs, Christianity is actually growing stronger to the point where Augustine comes along and then publicly declares the city of God as the ideal. And then God's ideal then continues. There's a crossover here. And then the time of the Charlemagne is when really that ideal sort of reaches, that sovereignty of God reaches a kind of a peak, where the Pope is a blessing, or shall we say, crowning an emperor there. And then also the Satan is going down. It looks like now Satan has been completely defeated. But then you go through the Christian empire, the divided kingdom, East and West, and the church now is losing its credibility. For various reasons. Corruption, and also the Black Death also had something to do with it, and so forth. And the results of the Crusades, people don't like losing wars. So then the church then is falling in credibility, whereas Satan's credibilities and sovereignty seems to be rising them. And but then Satan's credibility then begins to decline again, and then God is rising, and especially through Luther, calling for the reform of the church, so that by the time that the second coming occurs, then God's sovereignty then is becoming now paramount through the world again. So this is the Cain type view of life, or humanism and Hellenism, and the Abel type view of life of Godism or Hebraism. Yeah. So the development of history of the eras of the Providence Restoration. Oh, it's noon. Okay, let's take a break, and we will continue with this at 1 o'clock.